T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
40 years ago, the Challenger disaster rocked the world. It not only changed NASA, it continues to shape spaceflight today.
And the reason is that this disaster was not just a technical failure, it was a human one. You see, warnings were raised and risks were known in advance.
There were cracks in them. And he said, these people are sitting on a bomb.
When I saw it explode, I couldn't believe it. And we just knew that it was our motor and that the joint had failed.
But the launch went ahead anyway, and 7 people died. So why did that happen?
2 issues straight away. First, why was a teacher on board? And second, what lessons have we learned?
Hi, I'm science reporter Fiona Pepper.
And I'm self-confessed space science tragic Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki, a.k.a. Dr. Karl.
And you might have noticed Karl is in his home.
I've got a new variant of the flu. It's influenza A, and the variant is called H3N2, wait for it, Super K. Is it named after me? No. I'm sure I'll get better.
I don't want to catch the flu, but yes, Karl and I want to have this conversation. So let's go back in time to January 28th, 1986. We're in Cape Canaveral, Florida.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Oh my God, I still remember where the single straight line of exhaust plume turns into the letter Y and bad things happen. Oh my God.
Karl, do you remember where you were when you first saw that footage?
Yes, my mother and I were living on 2 small houses on 1 block of land, and so I went to have breakfast with her, and she said, look at this on the TV, and oh my God, there it was.
So I was practically a newborn at the time, so I have zero recollections of that day. But for the past few months, I've been digging into this Challenger story and speaking to people who were directly involved, and oh my God, the things that I have learnt.
I'm very confident that you've discovered a lot more than I have picked up since then, so I'm really excited to find out what you've discovered. I just love this topic to pieces. In fact, my interest in the Space Shuttle program launched me into the media.
But I have a sneaking suspicion that you've always been a space guy, am I right?
Oh, yeah. I started reading science fiction when I was about 8 or 10. And I actually applied for NASA to become an astronaut and wrote down I'm young and fit and healthy and I'd pop by and I'd do martial arts. Can I become an astronaut? And they said, no, we're all full up. And anyway, we only employ Americans. Boo-hoo. But then I applied the knowledge to the ABC, and eventually here I am within the mothership of the ABC.
Okay, so it wasn't all bad then.
No, look, it turned out to have a good side, but I still love space to pieces, and the Space Shuttle program was so exciting. So when this thing happened, oh my God, it just struck me to the very core.
Yeah, this disaster was global news, but before then, the Space Shuttle program was struggling for public interest because basically NASA had set out to make spaceflight routine, and they succeeded with roughly a launch every single month.
But it goes back to earlier than that. So even back in the 69 and 70, they were doing the Apollo missions. Everybody in the world-ish watched Apollo 11. Most people watched Apollo 12. Apollo 13, the American TV networks decided to not cover it and switched over to the sport. I think it was baseball. Because, as I said, it was such an incredible feat of science and engineering. I would have kept on watching till Apollo 50.
I'm sure you would have. So the Space Shuttle program first launched in 1981, and 5 years into it, the public had basically tuned out. So NASA had to come up with some pretty wild marketing campaigns to get the public interested again.
Like the Space Cola Wars of 1985?
Exactly. That was when NASA sent Pepsi and Coke to space to try and figure out which was the preferred drink for astronauts.
Yeah, it's a bit of an engineering challenge because these drinks normally have little bubbles in them, but in microgravity, you get thousands of little bubbles going into one giant bub, and so they had to work out how to package a fizzy drink for microgravity.
Do you know which drink was preferred?
Neither. They both went down different pathways to make sure that they had bubbles in their brown drink, but they forgot to account for the fact that of all of the kitchens in the known universe, the Space Shuttle kitchen did not have a refrigerator. And when the astronauts were invited to drink this warm, very sweet, fizzy drink, they declined. Nobody won.
And then there was the Big Bird idea, right?
Break my heart, baby. Big Bird as in the giant big yellow bird from Sesame Street. Yes, they asked him to go to space, but not me. Boo-hoo, unfair.
Soz. So apparently NASA approached the guy who wore the Big Bird suit, his name was Karl Spinney, to see if he was willing to go to space, allegedly on the Challenger mission in 1986.
Well, surely the Big Bird suit would have been too big to wear on board during launch?
Yeah, it was. And I think there was only initial conversations. It never got further than that.
A bit of justice in the world.
But the idea that did take off was the Teacher in Space program.
It's long been a goal of our space shuttle, the program to someday carry citizen passengers into space. Until now, we hadn't decided who the first citizen passenger would be. But today I'm directing NASA to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, one of America's finest, a teacher.
It was a huge campaign. Something like 11,000 teachers across the USA applied.
That's right. It was a huge success. Amazing publicity for the Space Shuttle program. Basically, the public were hooked and the finalists would teach from space.
And the finalist who won that was Christa McAuliffe.
She was in her mid-30s, she was married, she had 2 kids, and she was a social studies teacher at a high school in New Hampshire. And it's kind of no wonder that Christa McAuliffe was chosen, because if you watch any videos of her, she was magnetic. She's charismatic. Karl, what do you think? If Christa McAuliffe did get the opportunity to teach from space, what do you think that would have meant for kids around the world?
It's a twofer. Firstly, teaching is a sacred profession. Going back 2 million years ago, when our ancestors taught each other how to break rocks to make a blade sharp enough to cut through elephant skin. And secondly, she was doing it for the local kids' lives. It would have been a glorious thing.
But of course, she never made it.
No.
And that brings me to the idea of risk. The very nature of spaceflight is experimental. So essentially, it's never completely safe, is it? And I think it's something that's important to acknowledge, particularly when NASA chooses to send civilians to space.
The astronaut pilots are different from people like you and me. These are people who can compartmentalize their emotions and make life and death decisions. And if it turns out that for the good of the group of 6 that I have to die, they'll make that decision. They're very aware of the risks.
So it makes me think of Commander Dick Scobee. He was a former test pilot, and he was probably very aware of the risks involved in spaceflight. I spoke with his widow, Scobee Rodgers, and she actually told me that well before the Challenger launch, he took all of the shortlisted teachers aside and just really spelt out the risks involved in spaceflight so they knew what they were signing themselves up for.
He was so concerned that he asked me one day, there are 10 finalist teachers, and they're still being told it's like a commercial aircraft. But after the accident, nearly all of them told me what he had said to them, and that he showed great strength in comforting them to realize that it isn't just a commercial flight, to be aware. And in case you're the one selected, you don't want to be, now is the time to back out. So no one backed out.
And so NASA is in a kind of a bind. On one hand, they want to say, hey, we're all over this space travel thing, and it's just like taking an airliner, guaranteed you're going to get there alive safer than any other form of transport. But on the other hand, there were major risks which were kept in the background by people doing engineering all the time.
So, Karl, I wonder if you can step me through what made this space shuttle so experimental.
Well, the first thing is that the very first time you do something is the time you do it the second time. So the first time is totally experimental, and according to this model here, we have 4 components. And it was not a bad design, and in fact it worked incredibly well for, God help me, 3 decades. So firstly, you've got this part here, the orbiter, which is totally reusable. It goes up and it comes down and it glides maybe 2/3 of the way around the world, all the way from Perth across to California and into Florida. And then to get it into the air, you've got 2 major components. You've got one solid state booster here, solid rocket booster, and another solid rocket booster here. And these 2 white things, they provide 80% of the thrust to get off the ground, but only for the first 2 minutes. But meanwhile, burning all the time from launch, there's been the tons of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen in the external tank coming out through these little nozzles here. And so when you see the launch, you'll see this big flame coming out of here, and only these little flames here. And then between them, they have to apply this energy over a period of 8 minutes. And we're talking colossal energies. We cannot release all that energy in one go. Release it slowly over 8 minutes. And with luck and with clever design by engineers, you'll end up at 400 kilometres up doing 28,000 kilometres an hour.
Can you point out to me which parts were reusable?
Everything except the external tank. The external tank got thrown away. This guy here, the orbiter, flew up and then flew back down and glided all the way. These were the solid rocket boosters, and at the very tip, there's a parachute. So they would fall into the Atlantic Ocean, be recovered, brought back, broken into the 4 major segments containing the solid fuel, and then put back together again. And the idea is that you've got this reusable thing that it takes off like a rocket, glides back down, and then after it lands, we hope, you refuel it, polish it up, maybe clean the windows, and it can take off like an airplane again. Cue the airline comparisons.
You make it sound easy, but it never got quite that easy or straightforward, did it? Because it was such a complex system. And from speaking to people who worked on the program, engineers, they kind of suggested that they were constantly pushing this thing to its limits. I spoke to a man called John Tribe. He was a chief engineer on the shuttle orbiter. He worked on something like 85 flights before and after Challenger. And this is how he describes working on the space shuttle program.
The funding was such that the spares situation for the space shuttle program were very thin. And you know, with several vehicles in flow, we started to literally run out of hardware. You know, we were having to cannibalize hardware from one vehicle to the next to keep it flying. People would like to say that it's an aircraft, but it's not. You know, people talked about it becoming operational after 4 flights. It was never operational in that respect, like an airliner might be. It was a test vehicle all the way through its life.
My engineering training makes me weep when I realise that he had to take parts that had already been installed and pull them off and put them onto another space shuttle. What a waste. Oh, my God. There's something fundamentally wrong, a lack of forward planning. They had to go through that. That's just astonishingly bad.
Okay. But despite all of that, the space shuttle program still operated for decades.
And amazingly successfully. Decades? 3 decades. They pulled it off many, many times. 133 successful flights between 81 and 2011. That's 3 decades. Oh, my God, that's fantastic.
All right, but not all of the flights were successful, as we know. And when things went wrong with the space shuttle, they could be catastrophic. So, Karl, can you explain what specifically went wrong with Challenger? I know that theories emerged quickly after the disaster in 1986, and you even had some of your own.
I had my own guess. In fact, I had a regular segment weekly on the Midday Show with Ray Martin. So I went in to explain my theory to Ray.
Well, I kind of know that because we found the video.
Wow.
And we've dredged it up from the archives.
Please welcome our man of science, Karl Kruszelnicki.
Oh, my God. Who's that guy with hair?
We still don't know, despite yesterday's headlines, we don't know what brought down the shuttle.
Well, NASA's not speaking. They're saying we're going to wait until we get all of the data in. I've got my own theory. As it's going up, you can see those long, skinny cylinders on the side. They're the solid boosters. They're basically like a firecracker. You light them and then they just go. And you can see in the still that they're putting out much more smoke than those little flames on the back of the space shuttle engines. And my theory is that it's because they put out so much more energy that perhaps they developed a crack and then flames spurted out of those solid boosters into the space shuttle and it caused it to explode.
There we go. There's the worst of it.
I actually asked the Today Show producers to find some pieces of pipe so I could demonstrate what I meant with regard to the problem with the solid rocket boosters, but they couldn't get some in time.
Well, luckily we were able to source some pipes and send them to your house. So can you do the demonstration now, 40 years later?
Okay, so I actually did lay down many of the sewer pipes in Dapto in Wollongong. And so here you see a pipe, and when you try to join it end to end, mate, you don't get a good lead. But then notice that it flares out over here. See, it gets bigger, and then you got a pipe of the same diameter, and then it's got a rubber O-ring, and you shove it inside. For the space shuttle, when you're joining those 4 segments that have got all of this solid-state fuel inside, you're dealing with temperatures of thousands of degrees. The gas is very hot. So, of course, it's got to be more sophisticated than just a simple rubber ring, but that's the basic to it. You have a flare-out, you have a mechanism, and you have the rubber. And the rubber has to maintain its integrity. It's an essential part of the system.
And there's this huge liquid fuel tank right next to these flames, I'm taking it?
Sure, and that tank turned into this enormous fireball in the sky where a couple of thousand tons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen ignited immediately instead of slowly over 8 minutes.
This is something that I want to talk to you about because when we talk about Challenger, we often talk about the Challenger explosion. But from looking at the NASA findings, Challenger didn't actually explode. I'm going to show you a video you might not have seen. It's the launch video, but from a slightly different angle.
Approximately 1 second after initial breakup, film showed the front segment of the orbiter emerging from the cloud. A camera south of the launch pad recorded a wider array of debris exiting the vapor cloud. The left wing became visible at 78.531 seconds. The main engines and crew cabin are also identifiable.
I'd never seen that footage. Okay, the stack just didn't explode in the sky. It split into its different component parts. Disintegration.
And one of the most confronting things was, based on the NASA findings, is that at that point the crew was probably still alive. And they know that because each astronaut had a personal air supply, and 3 of those personal air supplies were activated.
I had no idea. So you're saying it was disintegrating and they would have known that something bad was happening, but they didn't know what. And yet, being trained, they had the presence of mind to activate at least each other's or their own air supplies. And then after that, they may or may not have lost consciousness. And so almost certainly the moment of death was a sudden impact when the crew compartment hit the Atlantic Ocean.
Exactly. That was an unsurvivable impact. The capsule was, I think, traveling at around 300 kilometers per hour, hit the ocean 2 minutes and 45 seconds after liftoff.
We come together today to mourn the loss of 7 brave Americans, to share the grief that we all feel, and perhaps in that sharing to find the strength to bear our sorrow and the courage to look for the seeds of hope. Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short, but we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain. Our nation is indeed fortunate that we can still draw on immense reservoirs of courage, character, and fortitude, that we're still blessed with heroes like those of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Dick, Mike, Judy, Elle, Ron, Greg, and Christa. Your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
Karl, the thing that really gets me with this story is that this is a completely avoidable situation. This disaster should never have happened.
Tragically, yes. So you've got one side, which is the technical side, and the technical cause was a failure of the rubber O-rings.
Yeah, so that was the technical cause, but this was a known problem. This problem with the O-rings was known amongst a group of engineers who tried to flag the issue with management. Now, there was a key group of 5 engineers. They worked at an engineering company called Morton Thiokol, which was a NASA contractor, and they had been concerned with the O-ring problem for a very long time, and they actually tried to stop the launch the night before it happened.
Wow, when you say known problem, when did it come up before the lead of the launch? Like a day or a week or a month?
Way before then, like November 1981.
What? 81? That's more than 4 years before the launch. That's almost the entire history of the Space Shuttle program. You're saying they knew there was a potential problem for all that time?
So they identified the problem from as far back as STS-2, the second space shuttle that went up. They saw erosion in the O-rings, and they became increasingly concerned about this issue. I actually spoke to this woman, Leslie Ebeling, the daughter of Bob Ebeling, one of the engineers who tried to stop the launch the night before it happened.
There was growing concern over a year, and he wasn't getting any help. NASA's on a schedule. We don't care. It was upsetting. It was really upsetting for him. I mean, the last year before the incident, he was very serious.
So what was his concern with the O-ring?
That they cracked. There were cracks in them. And he said, these people are sitting on a bomb.
So fast forward to late January 1986, and Florida is experiencing this unprecedented cold snap. Things were freezing over.
There are those famous and iconic photos of ice covering parts of the launch pad on that morning of January 28. And unfortunately, rubber and cold weather do not go together well. Rubber's kind of like a sponge that bounces back when you release the stress. When it's cold, it don't bounce back as well, unfortunately.
And that's what got these Morton Thiokol engineers so worried. When they saw that forecast, they organised an emergency meeting with their management and NASA management.
What a good thing to do. How did it go down?
Well, basically, they presented their data about the effect of cold on O-rings and how things could end catastrophically, and they suggested that NASA should not go ahead with the launch.
I'm guessing from what happened on the very next day that NASA didn't want to hear that?
No. They were on a very tight schedule, and that particular mission had been delayed a number of times.
Now, I'm guessing that each of the major subcontractors for the Space Shuttle program had to give their approval that their bit of it was going to work okay. Is that the case?
That's right. There was a lot of pressure on managers to approve this launch. At one point, one engineer was told to take off your engineering hat and to put on your management hat.
Oh my God, I hate that. Like, the reason that engineers wear engineering hats is so that you and I can confidently walk into an elevator or a lift and know that we will not die in the next 2 minutes. I love engineers.
Yeah. So in the end, NASA got unanimous approval from all of the managers.
The managers sometimes win over the scientists, and that's kind of what happened to me when I left my very first science job when I was 19 years old, working as a physicist at the steelworks. And I was testing the steel for the Westgate Bridge, and I found that its fatigue properties were inadequate. And I told the boss, and he said, I wouldn't be unhappy if you found that you'd made a mistake. I'm interpreting that, but I could be wrong, as my boss was telling me to fake the results. I could entirely be wrong, but that's why I end up sort of being unhappy with my first science job. In this case, the Challenger disaster could absolutely have been avoided.
And so many parallels. I actually spoke to the last surviving Morton Thiokol engineer who tried to stop that launch. His name is Brian Russell, and this is his recollection of the day of the launch.
When I saw it, when I saw it explode, I couldn't believe it. I don't know why. I just couldn't believe that it happened. And I saw Roger, who was closer to the front of the room, get up and get out and leave the room right at that point. And I stayed and saw the replay of it, and I realized that, oh, this is real. And I went down to his office, and we were both in tears, and we just knew that it was our motor and that the joint had failed. And it was just devastating to us to think that that had happened in actuality.
It's amazing that so many decades after, the emotion is still in his voice. The deaths that happened, he felt responsible for. So what happened next?
What happened next was President Reagan ordered an investigation.
This 250-page report is highly critical of the way NASA decided to go ahead with the ill-fated Challenger flight, despite the warnings that the booster rockets might malfunction in the cold weather. One commission member described that decision-making as a kind of Russian roulette. And as a result, the Rodgers Commission has recommended a complete overhaul of NASA's management structure.
Well, Dr. Fiona, I'd like to say, or at least hope, that NASA learnt their lesson from that finding, but didn't history repeat itself?
That's right. Then nearly 2 decades later, another tragedy.
Tonight, America in shock as the space shuttle disintegrates minutes before landing.
The Columbia's lost. There are no survivors.
A 16-day mission ends in disaster. 7 astronauts are dead.
But this time it wasn't the O-rings, right?
Right, so it was the left wing of the orbiter on the leading edge where the ultra-special heat-resistant insulation was. They got damaged during the launch when it got hit by debris falling off the external tank. And the part that got damaged protected the shuttle from extreme heat, such as 1600 degrees C, when it's gliding back down through the atmosphere, and the heat protects it from an aluminium frame, which is good for 180 degrees C. So you really need that external heat insulation. Hot atmospheric gases penetrate, they play like a blowtorch, and in this case, the Columbia did disintegrate while it was descending over Texas, got practically all the way across to Florida, and it killed all 7 astronauts on board.
Awful. But again, this issue with the debris, it was a known issue, right?
Yeah, they'd been dealing with it for the entire space shuttle program, and they'd even given it a name, a foam strike, the foam being the insulating foam on the outside of the external tank to stop the liquid oxygen and hydrogen from evaporating. And the damage from these strikes was usually minor, but for Columbia, no, it was catastrophic.
And once again, NASA had limited its investigation into this problem before the re-entry of Columbia, and it ended in complete disaster.
And you're kind of thinking perhaps avoidable?
Exactly. Okay, so Challenger, Columbia, how is this all relevant today?
Well, in the year 2026, NASA is preparing to send astronauts around the moon and become the most distant humans from Earth ever for the first time in some 50 years.
The Artemis II mission. Karl, how do you feel about it?
Well, I'm a big fan of space travel. It consumes a very small amount of our total budget and it gives us such great benefits. I really hope it goes well because, firstly, a big picture, it's a big step for humans going into space. And locally, I just hope that nobody has bad things happen to them, especially the astronauts.
Exactly. Dr. Karl, thank you for chatting all things Challenger with me, even when you're influenza A positive.
Well, it was a lot of fun. And audience, beloved audience, thank you so much for watching.
Get better soon.
Bye.
Oh, you're there. So, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to ABC Science YouTube for more. And for even more about the Challenger story, check out our podcast, Science Friction, The Challenger Legacy. It's got heaps of details, loads of interviews, and why it's relevant today. See ya.